Story time. Anyone out there? Tuesday night. Time for bourbon and scary stories with yours truly. So check in. Say hi to everyone. Let people know where you're from, city, state. If you're from out of country, let us know. Let us know what bourbon you're drinking, or if you're drinking something else, wine or vodka, let us know what you're drinking. It's good to see you. Everyone checking in. All right. Hi, Kathy. Hey, Beth. There's Donnie, Deanne, Debbie. Good to see you all again. And if you're here for the fourth night in a row, make sure you let people know that you've been in it for the long haul. So this is our fourth night. All right. So time to get the bourbon and go to the Magic Library. So let's go get the bourbon. All right, I'm doing Evan Williams 1783 tonight, one of my favorite bourbons. And if you didn't know, Evan Williams is considered the first distiller in Louisville. Some people dispute that, but anyway, that's their claim to fame. So love Evan Williams. Got my snifter already, and time to go to the Magic Library. Oh, let me grab my magic candle from the Witches Market in Mexico City. We'll take that into the library. And if you haven't been with us before, this is the Magic Library behind my secret door in the living room. I'm gonna put my bourbon down here. Take a look around the Magic Library. And we're going to settle in. Yeah, I like the ghosts. I like the ghosts back there. All right. Let's do it this way. How's everyone's hair doing? I think I'm going to have to cut my bangs pretty soon. It's getting pretty bad. Let me turn this off. So, if you don't know, the backstory to what we're doing is because I can't be out giving tours at night like I normally would, telling ghost stories about Old Louisville, which is a neighborhood I love and which a lot of people know in the Kentucky area. I'm going to tell stories that I would normally tell as we're doing our evening ghost tour. And these stories come from my 11th book, which is True Ghost Stories and Eerie Legends from America's Most Haunted Neighborhood. And what we're going to do every night at 9 o'clock until the stories run out, I'm going to tell you stories from this book. Thanks, Eileen. I'm glad you think the hair looks good. And when we're done with the stories from that book, I'm just going to start reading from my very last book, my 12th book, which is called Voodoo Days at La Casa Fabulosa. And last night, we talked about the house where I used to live, which is the house on the cover of this book. And it's what got me interested in the old Louisville neighborhood. And for the first year we were in this house, a lot of strange things happened that people would say were paranormal in nature, and that's how I eventually got into writing about the neighborhood, its ghostly history, its great architecture, and things like that. And that's how I got into giving tours and kind of trying to show off this great neighborhood. If you don't know anything about Old Louisville, it's one of the largest historic preservation districts in the country. We have 45 square blocks of old houses in that area. Roughly 1,400 structures. Most of these are old homes and mansions. They've been around for 130 years on average, so they've seen a lot of history, so not surprising there's a ghost or two knocking about. In recent years, they've been calling Old Louisville America's most haunted neighborhood because you can't go more than half a block down there without there being a reportedly haunted house. Hey, Andrew. Hi, Kathy. Hey, Ashley. Timothy. Jessica Garcia. Hi, Caressa and Michael. Glad you're checking in. But this book, by the way, is kind of the most updated book. It's a compilation of my 3 first book. So most people know this book. It was my very first book. It came out in 2005. It was followed by Phantoms of Old Louisville, and then Haunts of Old Louisville. So a couple years ago, I edited and updated all the stories because people got in touch with me over the years. They gave me new information, shared pictures, death certificates, and things like that. And that's why I put this one, kind of a best of collection, together. So you can get this on Amazon. You can also listen to it on audible.com, as you can with this one, my 12th book, which is actually coming to my favorite book. I had so much fun writing this book. Half the time I was laughing when I wrote this book. So if you like a little humor, hang in when we start reading this next week. A lot of funny stuff happened. But, so everyone got their bourbon? Everyone settling in, ready to start? Who else? See, Gwen, Ryan, Lindy, Marsha Andrews, good to see you. Hi, Kim. There's Andrew again. All right, there's Sheila. All right, so let's start with our official welcome. Cheers, and happy story time. Okay, so tonight I'm going to tell two stories that both are on 6th Street in Old Louisville, and on the same block. And if you don't know Old Louisville, there's 45 square blocks. In the center of the neighborhood is an area called St. James Court. It was built on the site of the old Southern Exposition. The Southern Exposition was a kind of early World's Fair that brought hundreds of thousands of people to Louisville back in the 1880s. And after the fair closed in 1887, the land where this massive wooden building stood, that was the main exhibit hall for the Southern Exposition, and which was said to be the largest wooden building in the world at the time, it was torn down. Hey, Allie. And on its spot, a developer put in a residential neighborhood modeled after London neighborhoods. It became known as St. James Court. And so at the center of St. James Court, we got a grassy boulevard, a beautiful fountain. We have Belgravia Court as well. It's one of the most charming parts of the city. Gas lights are on 24 hours a day. If you like Savannah, if you like Charleston, come to Old Louisville, because a lot of people make comparisons with those two cities. Hey, Jim and Michelle and Sue, Amy, good to see you. But so the first story tonight is about a house at 1439 South 4th Street, and it's where my friend Susan Shearer lives. And Susan is one of the guides that helps me out. If I'm not in town, if I'm off traveling, she'll help take over, do the history and architecture tours or the ghost tours. But we met when we were both very involved in the neighborhood. We were both on the Old Louisville Neighborhood Council. I was the secretary for a couple years, and she was the treasurer at the same time. And my first book had just come out, and she had read about it. She said, "Oh, if you want an interesting story, I've got an interesting story, because I live in a haunted house." And so she invited me over, and she told me about the place where she used to live. So Susan's house is a wooden house. And in Old Louisville, those aren't very common. Most of the houses in Old Louisville are built of stone and brick. And Susan's is a Queen Anne house. It's colorful. It's like a light blue, has cream and yellow trim. There's a nice little turret on one corner. It's like one of your quintessential Victorian houses. But she bought it in 2003, and she had lived in the south end of Louisville. And Susan said she had always been dreaming about having a house, an old house with a fireplace. And this house had several fireplaces. So she moved in. It had been turned into 4 apartments, though. It was a single-family house originally, but she had some work ahead of her. So she moved in. She and her sister Linda Gregory bought it together. And their plan was to fix it up and kind of retire and, settle there. And so right away when Susan moved into the house, she knew something was up, because weird things started to happen. Things would start disappearing. And just so you get an idea of what her house looks like, this is her house, the front of it on 6th Street. And Susan said she'd come home from the grocery store, and she'd have like 6 cans of vegetables in the bag. She'd walk out of the room, and she'd come back, and there'd be only 5 of them. And at first she thought she was just maybe imagining things, but it happened frequently enough that she started counting things. So she'd come home with 6 donuts from the bakery, and she'd count the 6 donuts. She'd walk out of the room, and then later that afternoon there'd only be 5 donuts in the bag. And this was when she was only the only person in the house. And so she knew something weird was going on because these things would go missing. And at least her ghost, it turns out, wasn't greedy. It could have taken all the things, but it only took usually one when there was many things. And other people started experiencing weird things in the house. Her son, who was there helping her fix things, he started noticing things as well. Susan said often she'd leave the room where she was painting or doing some work, and the radio would be on. She'd come back into the room, and the radio would be off when she was the only one there. Or vice versa. The radio would be off. She'd come back into the room, it would be on. And it happened enough that she would, make herself aware of what state the radio was in. She'd note that the radio was off. She'd go out of the room and, came back later and the radio would be on. So it was almost like something she could anticipate. But her son was there one day, and he had one of the weirdest experiences. He was on a ladder. He was fixing something up at the roof, at the ceiling level downstairs, and there was kind of an open hole they were fixing. It was the ventilator that went up to the second floor, where the old steam grate was. And he was standing there. He was the only one there. His mother had gone off. Susan had gone to the store. And he said, light was streaming down through this hole, and all of a sudden he heard like a step, and like something came and cast a huge shadow over the hole. And it just like stood there for a minute. And then after a minute, he heard another step, and this thing moved away, and then the light, came back shining through the window. And this happened a couple times, always when he was alone. And so he told his mother about this, and she had been having these other weird things happen, but she didn't really think too much about it at first. Things really started to change when they started hearing these knocks at the door every evening. So almost like clockwork, they said every night when the sun was going down, they would hear 3 or 4 loud raps at the front door. And whoever was home would run to the front door, open it, and they'd find no one was there. And Susan said after a couple weeks, after this happened almost every night, it was so predictable that they would stand at the door waiting to hear these knocks, and they'd pull the door open right away and look to the front porch and see who was there, and there was never anyone there. So this went on for a couple months, and this is about a half a year of Susan and her sister being in the house. And things really began to take a weird turn when Susan hired some workers. And one day she came home, and the workers she had hired to do some fireplace work, they informed her that in the dining room they had found something interesting in her fireplace. And her fireplace is kind of neat. It got a wooden mantle around it. And as the workers were working on the mantle, one of them realized that there was a secret compartment in the shelf. And it was like a spring-loaded door. You can push through the door, and there's a space. It's about the size that would fit like 3 or 4 shoe boxes behind the mantle. And as they were doing this work, he found this little secret door. He pushed inside, and he reached in, and he found an old picture back there. And it was a picture, a black and white picture of what looked to be a young girl, maybe 8, 9, 10 years of age, standing there, posing for the camera in a simple white dress, a shift, as the worker had called it. And when Susan came home, he said, "Oh, we found this in your fireplace. Did you know you had a secret compartment back here?" And she didn't know anything about it, and she loved it, of course. And I've been in the house. I've seen the fireplace. That little secret compartment is back there. It's really cool. But so she kind of dusted off the picture and sat it at the mantel shelf and decided she would have it framed and hung on the wall nearby, kind of as a memento of one of the, maybe original things that came with the house. And they weren't quite sure what era it was. The hairstyle was just kind of nondescript. It was straight hair. The dress was kind of nondescript. It could have been anywhere from 1910, to 1920s, 30s, 40s. They didn't know what era it was. But the funny thing is, Susan set the picture on the mantle. She went to bed, and when she woke up the next morning, the picture was gone. And she looked all over the house. She never found that picture again. And she was the only one there. Her sister was out of town. She was in Florida. Her son hadn't been over for the last few days. Susan was the only one there, but this picture disappeared and she never found it again. But from that point forward, they started seeing apparitions of a little girl on the stairs at the front of the house. And that's what Susan's house is known for. It's known for the ghost of the little girl in the white dress, which haunts the stairs at the front of the house. So Susan's son was the first one to see this apparition. It was a couple months after Susan had moved in. They were still working on the house and fixing things. And he was there alone one night, and the knocks came at the front door like they were accustomed to. He knew he wasn't going to find anything at the front door, but he went after he heard these knocks at sundown, opened the front door, and of course no one was there. But as he stood there looking out onto the street in front of the house, he said all of a sudden he got a strange feeling. The hair on the back of his neck started to stand on end. The hair on his arms began to prickle, and all of a sudden he felt like it... Pat's asking if it was back, the picture was back in its secret spot. No, the picture was not back where it was. But Susan's son stood there, and all of a sudden he realized that it felt like someone was watching him. So he closed the door and he turned around, and there on the stairs was this little girl in a white dress. And he said she looked like 8, 9, 10 years of age. He didn't see the picture, but he had heard about it. But he surmised that this must have been the girl that his mother had seen in this picture. And the girl, she didn't really have any kind of malicious expression. She just kind of looked at him, and then she faded away. And from that point forward, 2 or 3 times a week, they would see this little girl on the stairs at the front of the house. And it usually was in conjunction with these knocks that they'd hear every night at sundown. So as often happens, work wound down. They finished their restoration projects. Eventually the house, all the projects were done. And that's when Susan said things started to calm down. They say often, a lot of times when you move into an old house, you fix things, you start tearing down walls and knocking. A lot of times this wakes up the spirits. And so as things kind of returned to normal, the paranormal activities in the house began to wane. And Susan said every once in a while they'd hear knocks at the front door like they used to, but things didn't disappear like they had before. They weren't seeing the apparition, but Susan still felt like there was some kind of presence in the house. So that is about the time she met me, and we were on the neighborhood council. And so I went to her house, and she told me the stories and showed me the places she had talked about. And I knew a neighborhood psychic, and her name was Cheryl Glassner, and I put them in touch. And Cheryl came over one day and kind of did a reading. And usually what happens is whenever, because I'm very skeptical of psychics and mediums and stuff, a lot of them are charlatans, unfortunately. So I never tell them anything. I say, okay, I've got this house, you come with me and you tell me what you feel or what you find. I never give them any information, and the people who live there, I make sure they have no contact with them and they are not able to give them any information. But Cheryl went, and she had a pendant. She would go from room to room shaking this crystal, and she said she had this spirit guide. It was called the White Ghost, who would help her intuit things. And so what I thought was interesting is Susan, as Cheryl was going through the house, sat down on the front stairs, and Cheryl, the psychic, all of a sudden looked over and said, "There's a little girl in a white dress sitting right next to you. Have you seen a little girl in a white dress in this house before?" And of course, they had. So Susan, that was all she really needed to hear to make her, think that Cheryl was a credible psychic. And so we never were able to find out anything about this supposed haunting. We did research. The only thing we found out was that one time the house was called the slaughterhouse, and not as in like butchering animals, but the guy who built the house was William Slaughter, and he's the man that owned a lot of that area. He was the man that started the Victoria Land Grant Company after the big exhibit hall from the Southern Exposition was torn down, and he actually built that house. And after he built it, 3 families lived there. It was the Gurnets, the Chickerings, and the Tomerlins. And I found the names, I found deeds, but there was nothing in the historical record to kind of explain what might be going on by way of a haunting. And so what often happens when people tell me these stories and I do some research, you've got to rely on oral traditions and, the luck of the draw. Sometimes you just run into the right person and they tell you something that kind of fills in a story you've been researching. And so this was about 2004 as I was wrapping up research and writing my very first book. And back then I would often go on chat rooms and message boards and I'd say, oh, I'm looking for information about, this house at 1439 South 4th Street, or does anyone know about the family who lived in, the Conrad Caldwell house in the 30s? I put up, questions, and often people got in touch with me, family members, things like that. But that's what I did for Susan's house. And so not too long after I put a message on a local message board, I got an email, and it was a woman by the name of Mary Barton. She was in town from California, and it turns out she had spent some time in Susan's house. She was actually in-laws to the Chickerings, who lived there in the 1940s. And so I was really excited when I got this email. I asked her if she'd meet with me, and she said, okay. And so we met the next day at the fountain at St. James Court. We walked through the neighborhood, and she kind of told me a lot about what she knew. She and her husband were newlyweds back then, like the late 30s and early 40s. He was a soldier. And after World War II, they lived in Louisville for a couple of years, and then they moved to California, which is where she spent most of her life. But she said while they lived in Louisville, they would spend a lot of time at the house at 1439 South 4th Street because that was where her father and mother-in-law lived. And they would go to the house 2 or 3 times a week and have family dinners and things like that. The whole family, like the extended family, would come over. And she said her father-in-law wasn't doing very well at the time. They called him Uncle Chick, and he, I guess, had Alzheimer's. He usually sat in a chair in the corner, and he usually wasn't coherent. They had to take care of him. But every once in a while, he'd look up and he'd say, "Go get let the person at the door in," or "Go answer the front door. The little girl's there." And they just thought he was crazy or imagining things. But one night, she was there with him in the kitchen alone, and he was so insistent that she go to the front door that she went to the front door, and she actually heard a knock, and there was no one there. But when she turned around, she said she had seen a little girl in a white dress on the stairs. And that really kind of got me excited because I hadn't told her anything about what Susan had been experiencing. And that's what I do a lot with my research. It's only when I have 2 different sources that kind of cue me in on the same sighting or the same apparition that makes those sources, the corroboration is what makes me want to find out more about a story. And so when I found out she had seen the same thing in the same spot, totally independent of the woman who was living there at the present day, that's when I started, doing more research and trying to find out what I could find out. And I talked to Mary a little more. We met several times after that, but she put me in touch with one of the family members who had lived in the house before her in-laws had bought it, and they were the Tomerlins. And I met this old woman, I forget her first name, I think it was Sally or Sadie, but she was quite a character. She was like in her 80s, and we met for coffee one day, and she had all kinds of stories about the neighborhood. But I said, so, did you ever have any strange sightings? Did you have any ghost stories with your house? And she said, no. She goes, we never saw anything. We never had anything strange happen. But she said, we did have, the terrible event. And I said, what was that all about? She said, oh, haven't you heard about what happened? And, I hadn't heard anything. So I said, what happened? And she said, she goes, well, when my mother was living there, in the Great Depression in the 20s and 30s, I was in high school, and she said back then, to make ends meet, a lot of people were taking in boarders. So her parents rented out the second floor of the house to two different families. And one of them was a single mother who was raising an 8-year-old daughter. And she had the apartment, the two rooms, kind of at the front of the house, at the top of the stairs. And supposedly, because her mother would cook for the boarders, they had a grocery delivery coming every night for the next day, and it usually came like 5, 6, 7 at night, around sundown. And the delivery man would always knock on the door 3 or 4 times very loudly. He'd leave the basket of groceries in front of the door, and then he'd just go back to his truck. Well, one night this happened, and the woman said her mother wasn't home, and the little girl and her mother at the top of the stairs were home. And it turns out this little girl probably was autistic or something. They just said she had behavioral problems. She was like a wild child. But because the mother wasn't home, the boarder in the room at the top of the stairs heard the knock at the door, and she knew the mother wasn't home, so she went down to bring in the box of groceries. She opened the door, and while she was out on the porch bringing in the groceries, the little girl got out of the room at the top of the stairs, ran through the front door out into the street, and was hit by a passing car, and she was killed. And the little girl was wearing just a simple white dress that came down to her knees, and she was 8 years old. So they think that the ghost of the little girl in the white dress that Susan and her family have experienced at their house on 6th Street is the ghost of this little girl. And this is one of the stories where I don't have a lot of substantiation. I did, when I found all this information, I looked up family names, I pulled up old newspaper articles and deeds and looked for death certificates, but this is a story I haven't been able to prove that there was an accident, that there was a little girl killed in front of the house. But what I think is fascinating is, several sources, all independent of the other, have had encounters with this supposed little girl in a white dress, and that, if nothing else, the oral tradition backs up that something terrible happened and that a little girl is haunting the steps in Susan Shearer's house at 1439 South 4th Street. So that is the William Slaughter house. And that's one of the first stories I wrote. That was actually in my second book, Phantoms of Old Louisville. So, like I said, that's the house on 6th Street. And normally this isn't a story I tell on our nightly ghost tour because we can only, cover so much ground in 90 minutes or so. So the good thing is about these nightly storytelling sessions we're doing right now is that I'm telling you a lot of stories that you don't hear on the ghost tour. So good for you. Okay, so the next story is also on 6th Street. Now, this is one of the first stories I investigated. A lot of people who read my books, they say this is one of their favorite stories because it's one of the creepier stories. And it involves a house at 1439 South 4th Street. And if you saw my Facebook invite for the storytelling tonight, it's that kind of dark picture with lights on in the window. It's this place. And in Old Louisville, locals call it the Slate House. Time for me to do a bourbon toast. Toast. Cheers, everyone. But the Slate House, as it's known, is unique. You go to Old Louisville, and most of the houses are built of stone and brick. But this one, it's built of wood. It has timber framing, and it looks like it's covered in shingles or clapboard. Actually, it's covered in slate. When they tore down the massive exhibition building from the 1883 Southern Exposition, they recycled a lot of materials, and they used the timber in the mansions and homes they were building. And in this case, they took the slate that covered the roof, and they covered this building that had been there. They think it might have been built in the 1860s or 70s already. And they totally rehabbed this building, and locals call it the Slade House, but officially in 1892, this became known as the Jenny Cassidy Free Infirmary for Women. So Jenny Cassidy was a very famous Louisville character back in the late 1800s. She was from a very wealthy family, and when she was a young woman, she was in a carriage accident downtown. The carriage overturned, she broke her back, and she ended up paralyzed. The rest of her life, she was in a wheelchair, but they say that didn't stop her from doing all these wonderful, great works. She was part of what was known as the holiness movement. She thought it was her, she was a Methodist, she thought it was part of her calling to help the underprivileged. And so she set up hospitals for poor people, especially poor women back in the day. She set up vacation homes for young women in the day, like they could go and have a week where they didn't have to work. They could play tennis and swim and things like that. Back in the 1880s, 1890s, that was revolutionary. And so she had so many admirers and so many friends in Louisville that in 1892, to honor her while she was still alive, they acquired the building at 1412 South 6th Street. They rehabbed it, they updated it, and they turned it into the Jenny Cassidy Free Infirmary for Women. So it would be a clinic to serve the underprivileged women in the neighborhood. Jenny died just a year or two after. She died in 1893, but it still had her name, and she left her mark on the neighborhood. Eventually, a couple years later, this became McMurtry's Infirmary. A doctor moved in, and the history is a little murky on and off the decades after, but around World War II, it was turned into a residential unit. And actually, it's a residence today, and an architect lived there, and it's a beautiful place. But in the late 40s and 50s, 60s, this was turned into apartments, and that's when it acquired a reputation for being a haunted place. So I remember when I first saw that building, something stood out about it. It was so unique looking. It was kind of spooky looking. I knew there had to be some story there. So this is a case where I kind of went looking for a story just because it seemed like the place needed a story. And I found some people who had lived there before, and they had reported strange events, usually apparitions in the front part of the house. What I heard most often was people who had lived there said there was the ghost of a woman hanging from the ceiling. One woman who lived in the front apartment, she said she was sitting at her dining room table one afternoon. She looked up, and in the corner of the room, she saw this figure that looked like a woman dangling from the end of a rope in the corner, way up high where the ceiling was. And several other people witnessed things like that as well, but none of them had any explanations or had any ideas where it could come from. It wasn't until I met a guy named Jack Conger that I was able to kind of piece together a little more about the history of this place. And so I met Jack Conger when I was working on my first book. I think he was living in Louisiana at the time, had come back to Louisville or vice versa. But in any case, his family was from Louisville, and he was in his 90s. I met him at the old Louisville coffee shop. I was walking my dogs, and I came out after getting my coffee, and there he was feeding cookies to Rocky and Bess, and we struck up a conversation. And he mentioned that he was just back in town for a visit, and I said, you're from here originally? And he told me, oh yeah, I used to live over on 6th Street. And I said, oh, where on 6th Street? He said, oh, I used to live in the old place that was the hospital, the Slade House. And all of a sudden I got really excited. I said, and do you have any stories about that place? Whenever I'm researching a story, I never say, did you hear about this? I always just ask, if they know anything. I never try to plant any seeds to give them ideas. And they said, oh, I had lots of weird things happen there. Louisville, even back then, it was a colorful neighborhood. And he said, and he goes, I don't know if you like hauntings and things like that, but that place is haunted as the Dickens. And Kathy's asking for another picture. That's the old Slade House, the Jenny Cassidy Free Infirmary for Women. 1412 South 4th Street. All right. The 1400 block of 6th Street, Michael, actually, the Slate House. Yeah. So I said, "Oh, you want me to get you a coffee?" And so I got him a coffee. We sat down, and we were outside. The dogs were the dogs loved him. He was feeding them cookies, sugar cookies. And I said, "Well, yeah, tell me about that place. What happened when you lived there? How long did you live there?" And he told me he lived there in the late '40s. So he was a young man. He was in his 20s. He had fought in World War II. He came back to Louisville, and the war had interrupted his studies, and he had 1 year to finish up his studies. So he came back, and he rented an apartment in 1412 South 6th Street while he was doing his last year of studies to finish his degree at the university. And he said he didn't have much of a social life. He had friends. He'd go out every now and then, but he said, he was pretty busy studying, and he had kind of a daily ritual. He'd go to classes during the day and afternoon, and usually by the early evening, he was done with his homework and studying and reading and things like that. And he had a ritual. He didn't have a big apartment. He said it was just a kitchen, a nice little sitting room, and a bedroom and a bathroom. But he loved, when he was done with his studying and homework, he loved just sitting in the big armchair in the corner of his living room. He had a big old-fashioned radio on a table. He'd listen to the radio, and he would leaf through magazines. And he had a big floor lamp that stood behind his armchair. And he said that was his nightly ritual. Sometimes he'd go out, he'd meet friends, but for the most part, he'd just sit there, leaf through magazines, and read and listen to the radio for a couple hours before he went to bed. Well, he said one night, this is 3 or 4 months after he had moved in, he said, what's Byron? Okay, yeah, all right. I'm just kind of reading some of the comments. Hi, Helena. Hey, there's Ashley. Hey, Elizabeth. But he said one night, he had done his nightly ritual. He had been in his armchair for 2 or 3 hours, listening to the radio, reading magazines, and he got tired. He went to bed, but he fell asleep, and several hours later he woke up because he could hear music coming from the living room. And he turned over in his bed, and he said through the crack under the door that went into the living room, he could see light was streaming through. So he figured he forgot to turn off his lamp and his radio, so he opened the door, went back into the living room, and sure enough, the lamp was on, the radio was blaring, and so he clicked them both off, and he turned to go back to his bed, but as he turned, he saw all of a sudden the lamp came back on and the radio came back on. And he turned around, and like the radio was on louder than before. It seemed like the light was modulating, it was flickering, it was getting brighter and weaker. And he turned off both of the switches again, and as he turned to go back into the bedroom, they came back on again. So all of a sudden he started to realize something wasn't right, and he didn't want to deal with it. So he jumped into bed, threw the covers over his head, and tried to ignore the strange things going on in his living room. And he fell asleep like that. Well, the next night, the same thing happened. He was a little hesitant when he went to bed after reading and listening to the radio, but he wasn't able to fall asleep because he knew something was going to happen. And sure enough, a couple hours after he went to bed, he said all of a sudden, he could see light kind of leaking through the crack at the bottom of his door. And he had turned off the radio. He had turned off the light. He knew they weren't on, but they had come back on again. He went out into the living room. Sure enough, the lamp was on. The radio was on. He turned them off, and sure enough, they came back on again. Finally, he yanked the plugs from the sockets in the wall. He thought that would take care of things, and he turned to go back to his bedroom. But what happened as he went back to his bedroom? Both the lamp and the radio came back on. And he turned around and he looked, and he could see the sockets were empty. The cords were lying on the floor. They weren't plugged in, but there the radio was, going full blast. The light was bright and it was modulating, going from dimmer to brighter. And that's when he started to notice that the radio was kind of staticky. And then all of a sudden he noticed like the dials were moving, and it was like going from station to station. And he didn't want anything to do with it. He jumped back into his bed and plugged his ears, pulled a pillow over his head, and kind of went to sleep that way. And the next couple nights, he broke up his nightly routine and decided he wouldn't sit there in the living room listening to the radio and reading his newspaper articles. He went out with friends, and he came home when he was tired, and he jumped into bed, and he was very tired. He hoped that he'd go to sleep and not have to deal with anything in his living room. Well, that worked for a couple nights, but a couple nights after, he was back in his living room, back to his evening routine, and sure enough, after he went to bed, the same thing happened. He woke up, and he could see light streaming in through the crack under the door, going into the living room. And he kind of knew what to expect, so he got up, dragged his carcass into the living room. Sure enough, the radio, the lamp were going full blast, and he had unplugged them like the previous couple nights before, and they weren't even plugged in, but they were still going full blast. And he stood there, at a loss for words. He didn't know what to do. And that's when he said he started to realize that he could hear something in the background. It sounded like a moaning and a groaning. And he stood there, and like from the walls around him, he said it seemed like he could hear women in pain, kind of screaming and groaning. And the longer he stood there, the louder these noises got. And so he didn't want to deal with it. He jumped back into bed, put his pillow over his head, and fell asleep that way. And the next couple nights, the same thing happened. Every night he went to bed, he'd be awakened by the sound of music coming from the radio that wasn't plugged in. He'd see light in the living room from the lamp that wasn't plugged in. And the more he tried to ignore it, the more these groans and these shrieks of pain seemed to come from the living room. Well, one night it was so loud he couldn't take it. He went out there to see what was going on, and as he stood there, seeing the lamp radiating light when it wasn't plugged in, listening to the radio make music when it wasn't plugged in, he said all of a sudden he noticed that the radio and the lamp started to move, and the radio lifted off from the table. It kind of levitated in the air. The lamp lifted off its stand on the floor and started levitating in the air. And all of a sudden, he said the room started to fill up with a strange fog. It was like clouds came into his room. He started feeling dampness on his hands, and all of a sudden, like the whole living room was full of fog, like a huge cloud had come into the room, and it started to rain inside of his room. So by then he knew something was wrong, so he ran from the house, and he went to a local donut shop and had coffee and donuts all night, and decided he was going to go back there when it was nighttime. And so he waited till the sun came up. He went back, and when he got back, there were like puddles of water in his living room, and there were like puddles of water on the tables, the surfaces. So he knew he hadn't been imagining things. So he used a towel, wiped up everything, and the next couple nights he stayed away because he was afraid of this happening. Well, after several nights away, he realized he had to do something about this. He had to deal with it, either confront it or see what would happen. So he came back, and sure enough, the next night he was back, the same thing happened. He woke up in the middle of the night. The lamp, the radio were on in the living room next door. He went out there. He heard the screaming and the groaning, like the moans of pain, and sure enough, the fog rolled into the room. He started realizing that there was condensation all over the place. Water droplets just fell from the ceiling. And this time, he realized when he looked into the fog, he could see like three shapes standing there. And it looked like three women, three female forms were standing in the fog, and like their faces were contorted in pain. And he realized these three beings he was seeing were the ones who was making this noise. So he was freaked out. He ran from the house. He went to that donut shop where he had hung out the night before, and he didn't go back till the sun came up the next morning. Well, by this point, he knew something was seriously wrong. He was a good Catholic. He knew that was probably something demonic or spiritual. So he went to St. Louis Bertrand Catholic Church. It's just a couple blocks to the north, down 6th Street from where he lived. So he went to the church the next morning and talked to his family priest and asked if the priest would come and do a prayer or an exorcism of the house, because he knew he probably needed someone to cleanse the place. Well, the priest's name was Father Joe, and he was an old man back then. And when Jack went and saw him and kind of explained what was happening, the priest just kind of dismissed. He said, "Oh, it's the modern age, we don't believe in things like that anymore. There's really no such thing as ghosts and things like that." He says there's probably some other explanation. And Jack said, "No, there's really something going on in my little apartment. You need to come and check it out." He says, "I've seen ghosts. I've heard things. It always rains in my living room every night." And the priest just kind of shrugged his shoulders and told him not to worry about it. It was something perfectly normal. Well, Jack went home. He was kind of crestfallen, and sure enough, the next couple nights, the same things happened. He would wake up, and the radio would be on, the lamp would be on. He'd go out there. The fog would kind of congregate. It'd start raining in his room. He'd hear these screams and groans, and sure enough, he'd see these forms, these 3 forms, female forms, emerge from the fog, and it seemed like they were beckoning him, like they had something to tell him. Well, finally, he had had enough. So the next morning, he had spent all night at a donut shop again. He went and got the priest and he says, "You have to help me. This, is not going away." And he said, "You're the family priest. You have to help me." He said, "At least come and look at the place." And Father Joe finally relented. He said, "Okay, well, let's go." He says, "I got some time right now. Let's go and check your place out." So Father Joe grabbed his satchel, with his holy water and all the Catholic good stuff, and trudged behind him. They started walking down 6th Street, and 15 minutes later, they were in front of Joe's apartment at 1412 South 4th Street. And the priest just kind of stopped and looked up, and he said, "Oh, you didn't tell me you live here." He said, "I've been here before." And so Jack made him come inside with him and made him tell what he knew about the place. And it turns out that the priest, Father Joe, had been there indeed many times before, because he had been summoned on numerous occasions back in the late 1890s and early 1900s, when women were dying, and he was summoned to give them last rites. So it turns out the apartment where Jack had his quarters back in the day, when it was Jenny Cassidy's free infirmary for women, was the maternity ward. And it turns out that a number of women died in childbirth there, and that wasn't all that uncommon back then. And Father Joe said he couldn't remember how many women had died, and he had been summoned to give them last rites. So he told Jack all this as he was unpacking his crucifix and holy water and his Bible and book of rites and things like that, and he started blessing the place. And as he was blessing the place, Jack said all the stuff happened. The moaning and groaning started, the fog rolled in, the radio and the floor lamp started producing music and light, even though they weren't plugged in. And the floor lamp kind of lifted from the floor, started to levitate. The radio, the big chunky radio, lifted off the table. It started to levitate. And as the priest was saying his blessing and going through his rituals, sure enough, Jack said the 3 forms kind of emerged in the fog, and it was raining in the room. And the priest seemed kind of, not fazed by it. He kept saying his prayers and stuff. And that's when Jack said all of a sudden he realized that these were probably the spirits of women who had died, in childbirth. And he just, from the looks on their faces, he said he could make them out. He said he realized that they were probably women who had died giving birth to their children, and they never knew, what happened to their children. So as the priest was praying and doing all this stuff, Jack stepped forward. He said all of a sudden he wasn't afraid, and he tried to communicate with them. He said, "Don't worry." He said, "Your children are fine, and you're fine. As cliche as it sounds, go to the light, go to the other side." And once he said this, and he said he didn't know if he was speaking or communicating a thought message, but he said the message he had in his head was clear. And supposedly these three beings registered what he was saying, and they kind of stopped. They realized what he was talking about. They faded away. The fog kind of dissipated. It rolled out of the room. Things dried up. The radio and the floor lamp kind of sat back down where they were. And the priest finished up his blessing. And from that point forward, Jack never had any problems in that apartment. Of course, he moved out 2 weeks later, so who knows if there could have been problems. But what the priest said and what people who Jack talked to said is it probably was indeed women who had died there, and he kind of assured them, let them know that the children they had that they were never able to see had grown up and were happy. And he said he never had any problems afterwards. But like I said, he moved out, so who knows what happened. The funny thing is, though, after he moved out, other people moved in, and for the next 20, 25 years, 35 years, anyone who lived in that apartment reported strange things. From that point forward, it wasn't like clouds in the living room and raining and lamps going on and off without being plugged in, or the radio coming on and off. People often reported that they would see apparitions of women hanging from the ceiling. And when I wrote my first book, Ghosts of Louisville, which the story is in, I didn't include any of that because there was, it seemed like that was a denouement after finding out, that was the maternity ward, and that's where women had died giving childbirth. It seemed like that kind of put a button on the story. So I didn't mention any of the cases of people talking about seeing this apparition of a woman or women hanging from the ceiling. I also heard that people who lived there said that their pets would go crazy. Anyone who had a dog or a cat in that apartment, they said their animals are just like, once they moved in, their animals would just change, and they'd cower in the corners. They were always under their beds and things like that. That they knew something wasn't right with their animals. So, like I said, with this book, one of the reasons I did this book, an edited and updated version, is because over the years, people got in touch with me and they shared information, and they said, oh, this is the death certificate you were looking for. That was my aunt you were writing about. And after my first ghost books came out, people started getting in touch with me, sharing information, and a number of people got in touch with me about the place at 1412 South 4th Street. And one of them was a woman in California. Her name's Karen Marcroft. And it was right before this book went to print. And she had read some of my other books, so she knew I knew a lot about old Louisville. And she asked me if I would help her because she was doing some Ancestry.com things and came across a Louisville connection to her great aunt. And her great aunt's name was Ida Elf. And she didn't know anything except that her great aunt Ida had died kind of at a young age in 1926 in Louisville, Kentucky at 1412 South 6th Street. And she wondered if I knew anything about what was at that site. And right away I knew 1412 South 6th Street because that was the Jenny Cassidy Free Infirmary for Women. So I got in touch with her, and I was really excited to hear this because Karen really didn't know anything about the circumstances surrounding her great aunt's death. So by then I had been able to do more research, and I found out some very interesting things. After it became the Jenny Cassidy Free Infirmary for Women, after it was McMurtry's Infirmary in the 20s and 30s at least, maybe up through the 40s, the building at 1412 South 6th Street was known as the Louisville Neuropathy Clinic. And it was a hospital for women only. And, they didn't understand depression and social disorders and things like that. So if you were a woman and you were, not conforming, a lot of times, they locked you up. And it turns out in those years, the Jenny Cassidy Free Infirmary for Women became a place where depressed women retreated. And it turns out a number of these women who were treated at the Jenny Cassidy Free Infirmary for Women, which wasn't known as that at that point, committed suicide in that location. And I found out that Karen Marcroft's great aunt, Ida Ulf, was one of the women who committed suicide. And she committed suicide in the front right-hand corner of the building, which is the apartment, which used to be the old maternity ward, and which is where Jack Conger used to live. And Karen didn't really know anything about this. She did know that her great aunt was considered to be a difficult woman back then. And when I told her what I knew about the hospital and what I found out, she said it kind of fit in with what the family lore had. And so she actually sent me a picture of Ida Ulf's death certificate. So you can see it's from 1926, November, and the address is 1412 South 6th Street. So this is one of the stories where there's lots of substantiation, lots of documentation about women dying there. This was the most salient one for me, so that's why I included it in the book. But Karen included a picture of her great aunt, Ida Elf, in happier days. This is with friends on the river in a boat. And the one right here, the second one from the right, that's her Aunt Ida, not too many years before she killed herself. So, fascinating story, you know. Not only did we have women dying there because of, you know, conditions giving birth to children back then, but then we had the whole history of this being a kind of clinic for depressed women. And from what I've been able to dig up, at least 7 suicides took place in that front room, and who knows how many women died in childbirth. But it seems like the ghosts of the women who died in childbirth, they've settled down. And the architect who lives there today, he says, no, this place isn't haunted. He said he never had any problems. So maybe what Jack did, maybe what Karen found out kind of alleviated all the things. And as far as we know, the beautiful house at 1412 South 4th Street is quiet, and no paranormal activity is going on, but we sure know that in the past a lot of strange things happened. So that a lot of people think is one of the creepier stories, because there's so many witnesses who told me what they saw. There's documents that support a lot of the deaths and suicides that took place. So like I said, that's one of my favorite stories as well, and it's one you don't normally hear on our evening ghost story, because it's kind of a detour to go over to 6th Street, where Susan's house is, and where the house at 1412 South 6th Street is, that used to be the Jenny Cassidy Free Infirmary for Women. So hope you enjoyed the stories tonight. Tomorrow night, tune in again. Tomorrow night, we're going to do St. James Court stories. So there's the beautiful Pink Palace, and Thomas and V.G. Evers live there today. They're excited to find out more about the place they live in now, I should say. If you know old Louisville, if you know Louisville, the Pink Palace is one of our famous landmarks, one of the most striking mansions on the court. It's got an interesting history. So we'll talk about that tomorrow night, and also another landmark on St. James Court, the Conrad Caldwell House, which is a beautiful Richardsonian Romanesque house that was built in the 1890s, and they called it Conrad's Castle. It's a beautiful house museum today. It's the only place in Old Louisville that's open for tours. So if you take one of their tours, though, you got to be careful. It's haunted. Ghost hunters have been there. So being that it's not open, like a lot of things are closed now, I'll give you kind of an idea of what to expect when you go and check the place out. So like I said, in case you haven't heard, we're just going to plan on meeting every night at 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. So it's 8 o'clock Central. So we're on New York time here in Louisville, Kentucky. So every night at 9 o'clock for the next week or 10 days, I'll tell stories from my 11th book, True Ghost Stories and Eerie Legends from America's Most Haunted Neighborhood. when those stories run out, then I'll start reading from my memoir, Voodoo Days at La Casa Fabulosa. And I had so much fun with that book, writing about the real life characters in the neighborhood and the interesting characters that make life in old Louisville very unique. And then my friends, Wendy and Beth, Laura, Mike, all the people who are part of the Thursday night / Monday night / Tuesday night dinner club, Skippy, Gregory, there's Alan and Chris, so many people. We've had like over the years 30 or 40 people have all been part of the Monday / Thursday / Tuesday night dinner club. So they were all there as a lot of the stuff was going on. So they know a lot of these stories firsthand. A lot of them were there. So Voodoo Days is I'm really looking forward to reading that, because it was a fun book to write. And there's a lot of fascinating Louisville history. Did you know that Louisville at one time was Gypsy headquarters of the United States? In the 20s and 30s, thousands of gypsies would congregate here in the spring for Easter celebrations and the fall for harvest Thanksgivings. We had a voodoo presence. There were witches here back in the day. And this is all documented. This is not stuff I'm making up. So we have tons of fascinating history in old Louisville. So stay tuned every night at 9 o'clock Eastern time for the next 2-3 weeks. We'll be telling stories, and I'll be reading from my books, and I hope it helps you all get through this terrible situation we're in right now. Let's all cross our fingers and hope that soon we'll be seeing the other side of this. I know everyone's going through a lot of stuff. The only good thing about this is that we're all in the same boat, and we're realizing what's important. Friends and family and staying healthy is important. Watching out for each other is important. So I hope you're all doing as well as I'm trying to do. I'm trying to keep a good spirit, and I know it's going to be a rough couple weeks ahead, but we can get through this. And another good thing is we can get together. We got some downtime. We can think about what's important, and we can be creative. We can tell stories. It's like going back to the good old days when we had to rely on our friends and neighbors and family to keep us entertained. So I hope me doing this little part is helping you get through this all. And I know looking forward to this every night is helping me get through this all. I really enjoy seeing you all and seeing the comments, and just kind of reconnecting with a lot of you I haven't chatted with and talked to recently. So as much as you think I'm doing this for you, you're all doing this for me. So spread the word. Tell your friends and family to check in. I can still accept lots of friend requests, and I'm looking forward to the next 2-3 weeks, seeing you every night. So once again, if you're ever in town, back when things are up and running, come see us in old Louisville. Check us out, LouisvilleHistoricTours.com. That's the official tour company where I arrange things from March 15th to November 15th every night, 8 months out of the year, 7 days a week. Normally I'd be out tonight giving tours, but since we can't do that, here I am with you, telling you stories and trying to bring the neighborhood to life and make you understand why it's a great neighborhood, and hope that you can come see it and understand why so many people love old Louisville. And thanks to all the people who are helping me pull this off. My friend Sean, Huntley Media, they're doing the website redesign. Carrie Sweet, who does a lot of my book cover designs and brochure designs, things like that. We got a lot of great people in the neighborhood. So hang in there, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow night when we talk about the Pink Palace and Conrad's Castle, or the Conrad Caldwell House Museum at 1402 St. James Court. And I'm not sure what we're going to do the night after, but in the next couple nights I'll be talking about the house in old Louisville. So if any of you don't know about that, that's the current book I'm working on. It's a true crime book about the house at 1435 South 4th Street, where a grisly murder was uncovered the evening of June 17th, 2010. If you're from this area, if you're a true crime buff, if you've watched shows like Hell House or Deadly Sins on Investigation Discovery, or the first 48 or after the first 48 on A&E, you've heard about this story. It's a very bizarre story. Not only was there a body buried in the wine cellar of the basement, the house itself was an asylum back in the days. The two guys living there had an interesting personal life. We got counterfeit money, we got cross-dressers, we got disco balls, we got all kinds of things with this house. So make sure you stay tuned, because in 3 or 4 nights I will be telling you about the house in Old Louisville. But for the time being, tomorrow night we're going to talk about the Pink Palace and yeah, VG, it's the murder house, not too far from you, just a half a block down the road. But yeah, so tomorrow night it's St. James Court, the Pink Palace, and Conrad Caldwell House, Conrad's Castle, and look forward to seeing you all then. All right, thank you, good night, and cheers. If you have any questions, DM me or Facebook me. All right, take care. Bye-bye.